The Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire of India was one of the great empires of world history. This was the second of two great Islamic empires which dominated the history of the Indian subcontinent from the early 13th to the early 18th centuries. The first of these empires was the Delhi Sultanate. In many ways the Mughal Empire represents the climax of Indian civilization, before the coming of Europeans brought new global influences to bear on its ancient traditions. It marks the transition from medieval India to modern India. In 1525, a minor Afghan chieftain called Babur invaded northwest India. The ruler of the Delhi Sultanate, the large state which covered much of northern India at that time, moved up to meet him. The two sides met at the Battle of Panipat, in April 1526. There, Babur defeated and killed the last of the Delhi Sultans. Babur was of Mongol origin. As a result, he and his descendants were called the Mughal, Afghan for Mongol, dynasty. Babur had 3 years of hard fighting before he was able to defeat his many enemies in northern India, but by 1530 he had emerged victorious. However, he had been unable to establish order within the large territories that he dominated before he died in that year. Babur was succeeded by his son, Humayun. He faced a chat situation, and was unable to hold on to his throne in the face of numerous rebellions. Over the next decade he was driven back out of India into Afghanistan. His main and most able opponent was one of Babur's former generals, a far-sighted leader called Sher Shah. He established his power in northern India, and proved not only a successful military commander but also an able ruler. He reformed the currency and tax systems, and upgraded the road network. Like Babur before him, however, Sher Shah too died after only a short reign, in 1545. He had not had the time to firmly consolidate his power, and on his death internecine struggles immediately broke out. Humayun, who had meanwhile been holding out in Afghanistan, was able to mount a successful counterattack, and regained his throne by 1555. But once again fate intervened. The very next year Humayun died in an accident in his library. This event left his 12-year-old son, Akbar, the task of consolidating Mughal power in northern India. For the first years of his reign Akbar was dominated by regents, but in 1564, when 20 years old, he took the reins of power into his own hands. Akbar vigorously put down all opposition to his rule, including several major rebellions. He expanded the Mughal Empire far and wide over northern and central India, and initiated policies which would place Mughal power on much more solid foundations. These rested on the twin principles of religious toleration. Hindus of course made up the vast majority of his subjects, and political centralization. Akbar openly showed his approach to religious matters in the most public way possible, by marrying a Rajput, and therefore Hindu, princess. He abolished the hated tax on non-Muslims, and recruited Hindu nobles, especially Rajputs, into the highest reaches of government. Most remarkably of all, and in line with his own liberal religious convictions, towards the end of his reign he deposed Islam from its position as the official religion of the Mughal Empire. To concentrate government power more firmly in his own hands, Akbar strengthened and rationalized the central administration, and imposed a more centralized provincial structure across the empire. He also carried out a comprehensive land survey of the empire to ensure a fairer and more effective system of tax collection. In fact, he reenacted Sher Shah's reforms, and refined them to make them more effective. He insisted on peasants paying their taxes in coin rather than kind, and carried out a survey of agricultural land, for productivity and crops grown, to make it fairer. Akbar also carried out a major road-building program to improve connections between northern and central India with Central Asia, and the Silk Road, eastwards into Bengal, and westward to the Indian Ocean ports. A less welcome action of Akbar's came in 1571, when he moved the Mughal capital from Agra to a new city called Fatehpur. Despite the huge funds Akbar poured into its construction and the magnificent palaces he built there, it quickly proved unsuitable for the role. It was short of water and thus unable to house a large population easily. In 1585 he moved the capital to Lahore, and later to Agra. When he died, in 1605, Akbar bequeathed a large, peaceful empire to his successor, Jahangir. As usual in Indian politics, however, the death of an old emperor was the signal for rebellion to break out. Jahangir had to immediately face a rebellion, not from an ambitious noble or general, but from his own son. Jahangir continued Mughal expansion in central India, although gains here were somewhat counterbalanced by losses of territory in Afghanistan, at the hands of a resurgent Persia. Jahangir's last years were beset by rebellions and palace intrigues. In 1627 he died and was succeeded by his son, Shah Jahan, reigned 1627 to 58. Shah Jahan's accession was marked, as usual, by palace intrigues, which culminated in the slaughter of several of the emperor's brothers and cousins. Later in his reign, Shah Jahan had to contend with rebellions by Mughal generals and Hindu leaders alike also broke out. He was able to defeat all these, and his reign saw further expansion in the Deccan, as well as the recapture of Afghan territory lost in his father's reign. Further expeditions in Afghanistan and Central Asia were not a success, however. Shah Jahan moved his capital from Agra to Delhi in 1648 to shore up the defenses of the northeast of the empire. Shah Jahan is particularly noted as a patron of the arts. At his court he surrounded himself with the best poets and painters of the day. Above all he is famous for building the peerless Taj Mahal. Although Akbar's, Jahangir's and Shah Jahan's reigns had experienced palace intrigues and rebellions, these had all been dealt with comparatively easily and quickly, without much damage to wider stability and prosperity. Under these three emperors, the Mughal Empire had expanded in size, had experienced strong economic growth, and had produced wonderful art and architecture. In the long reign of the next emperor, however, the tide began to turn against the Mughals. In 1657, Shah Jahan fell ill, and unsurprisingly this was the trigger for an armed contest, 1657-9, between four of his sons. From this, Aurangzeb emerged successful, who imprisoned his father and began his long reign. Shah Jahan died in captivity in 1666. Aurangzeb, reigned 1657-1707, continued the expansionist policies of his predecessors. His campaigns pushed Mughal power further and further south, and under this emperor, the Mughal Empire reached its largest extent. However, even before Aurangzeb's accession the Mughals had been losing the support of some Hindus, and the new emperor's austere religious policies did not help. Aurangzeb was a devout Muslim with no patience for his predecessor's tolerant approach, and attempted to restore Islam to its former place as the official religion of the empire. He reimposed the tax on non-Muslims, and forbade the building of new Hindu and Sikh temples, and even the repair of old ones. Rebellions began to mount. The Jats, a tribal people in northern India, in 1669, Pathans, an Afghan group, in 1667 and 1672, Sikhs in the 1660s, their leader, Guru Tegh Bahadur, was brutally executed in 1675, and a major Rajput rebellion lasting from the 1660s through to the 1680s. Most dangerously, although it did not seem so at the time, the Marathas, a militant Hindu community based in central and southern India, also rebelled. Between c. 1655 and 1680, they had an outstanding leader called Shivaji, who not only inflicted humiliating defeats on Mughal forces, but laid the foundations for future Maratha success. The Marathas. Aurangzeb dealt with all these revolts with some degree of success, for a time. The Marathas, however, refused to recognize their defeat and after a short pause took up arms again. Aurangzeb spent almost the entire final 25 years of his reign in the Deccan attempting to deal with them. Little by little, however, they gained the upper hand against Mughal forces. By the end of Aurangzeb's reign they had effectively asserted their independence from the Mughals, and controlled large areas of southern India. Maratha success was not the only harbinger of decline for the Mughals. While Aurangzeb was attempting to deal with them in far-off in southern India, the collection of tax revenues was being affected by Aurangzeb's anti-Hindu and Sikh policies, which provoked widespread passive resistance from the Hindu majority and their leaders in the localities. Even many of his nobles resisted Aurangzeb's policies, and failed to implement them fully in their areas. With declining amounts of tax revenues coming into the treasury from the provinces, taxes had to be increased in these areas which were under more effective Mughal control. In 1707, when Aurangzeb died, the giant edifice of the Mughal Empire was beginning to break apart. The decline of the Mughal Empire. Aurangzeb's successors were more conciliatory in their policies towards their Hindu subjects. They abolished the tax on non-Muslims, and conciliated the Rajputs and Marathas. These measures met with some success, but in the process they effectively confirmed the de facto independence of both these groups. Many troubles. By this time, the fiscal position of the Mughal regime had become dire. It was unable to reward its nobles and officials properly, and this undermined their loyalty. Matters were made worse by vicious palace intrigues, wars of succession, and the rise of overpowerful favorites at court. Finally came a series of violent political feuds over control of the throne. These culminated in the execution of Emperor Farrukhsiyar in 1719. Overpowerful governors. In the absence of firm and consistent control from the court, provincial governors grabbed more and more power for themselves. It was in these years that the key areas of Hyderabad, Bengal and Orissa, Ayodhya and the Punjab, all slipped out from the effective control of the Mughal court. The latter, concerned primarily with ensuring the continued flow of revenues from the provinces, had little choice but to come to terms with these powerful governors, recognizing their wide-ranging powers in exchange for tribute. Invasions and raids. In the 1730s the Marathas, taking advantage of the unsettled conditions within the Mughal Empire, invaded northwards and eastwards, conquering much of central India. Then, in 1739, a Persian army under Nadir Shah invaded India and brutally sacked Delhi, the capital of the Mughal Empire. He returned to Persia laden with booty, including some of the most priceless regalia of the Mughal emperors. He also forced the Mughal court to cede large amounts of territory in Afghanistan and northwest India to him. The northwest defenses of what remained of the Mughal Empire were now destroyed, and chieftains from Afghanistan repeatedly plundered these regions. At the same time the Marathas were raiding from their new bases in central India. Continued Mughal prestige. Despite all this, the Mughal emperor and his court remained a powerful symbol of authority. Afghans, Marathas, and the increasingly independent governors, sought to control the court rather than destroy it. They needed the legitimacy that it conferred on them to maintain their authority over local populations. By the mid-18th century, therefore, a sort of confederacy of regional principalities had emerged, all proclaiming some kind of loyalty to the shadowy Mughal emperors in Delhi but each pursuing its own interests in rivalry with the other power centers. Puppet rulers. As a centralized state, however, the Mughal Empire was no more. Mughal emperors continued to reign in theory, but were completely unable to control the forces swirling around them. Their effective power did not reach much beyond Delhi and its surrounding territories. Then, as the British gained control of more and more of the subcontinent, the Mughal emperors suffered the fate of becoming puppet rulers, increasingly propped up by British power. Finally, in the Great Rebellion against the British in 1857-8, the rebels took control of person of the last Mughal emperor and set him up as a figurehead, to which, they hoped, the Indian population would flock and drive out the foreigners. But the time had passed for such an outcome to be a serious possibility, and the last Mughal emperor ended his days as an exile in British captivity. The government of the Mughal Empire. The fact that the Mughal Empire lasted for over 150 years shows that it was built on strong foundations. These were largely laid down during the long reign of the Emperor Akbar the Great. Government personnel. The Mughals' roots lay in Afghanistan, where nobles were used to sharing power with their monarch. This was not a recipe for efficient, stable government, however, and conflicted with Akbar's ambition to hold as much state power as possible in his own hands. He therefore encouraged men from different backgrounds, Indian Muslims, Persians, Hindu Rajputs, to join the Mughal imperial service, and appointed many of them to high office. The Mughal nobility. To incentivize them to work together effectively, Akbar created a single imperial nobility based on a hierarchy of military ranks. Its members, Mansodars, were given differing amounts of land, jagirs, according their rank, from which they received tax income. These parcels of land were held at the emperor's pleasure, were not inheritable and could not be bought or sold. They did not come with any public authority over the farmers and other people living on them, other than the collection of revenue. From the revenue that was collected, the Mansodars were required to contribute a certain number of soldiers to the imperial army, ranging from 10 for the lowest rank of Mansodar to 5,000 for the highest, usually a prince of the royal family, or in some cases a leading Rajput prince. Men from the various backgrounds mentioned above could rise through the ranks of the imperial service to the highest posts. This was thus an aristocracy of service which were only partially non-Indian in origin, and reflected something of India's diverse ethnic and religious composition. Its members were motivated to work loyally for their imperial masters through a regular system of promotions and other rewards. Administration. Central administration. Akbar set up an efficient central administration, which at the top was divided into just 4 departments, those of the Prime Minister, the Minister of Finance, the Paymaster General, and the Chief Justice, who was also responsible for religious affairs. These ministers were appointed by the emperor himself, and held office at the emperor's pleasure. The responsibilities of each department were well defined, so the ministers had clear accountability to the emperor. Provincial administration. Provincial administration was also made more clear-cut. The empire was divided into 15 provinces, each under a group of senior officials, a governor, a military commander, a religious administrator and a judge. This separation of responsibilities tendency to create tensions within this group, and therefore increase central control over provincial officials. This was enhanced by the fact that there were also agents stationed in each province whose job it was to keep the court well informed on what was going on. Localities. The provinces were divided into districts, each with its military officer, tax collector, judge, official in charge of public works, especially sanitation, police and administration, head clerk and treasurer. Towns and villages had their own councils, who had wide responsibilities to run affairs within their communities. Revenue collection. Through a long process of trial and error, Akbar and his ministers refined the revenue system so that it was as fair to farmers as it could be whilst yielding large revenues for government. The final system placed a severe tax burden on the peasantry, between a third and half of what they produced. However, it took account of agricultural productivity of the land, and the different crops grown. The tax was payable in copper coin. This forced peasants to sell produce in local markets to get the cash to pay their taxes. It encouraged the spread of the market economy, and stimulated economic expansion. It also led to the rise of moneylenders and grain dealers in the countryside. The system was operated by well-trained, professional officials and clerks. Crucially, it had the support of the local elites, including the hereditary revenue collectors, the zamindars. These were effectively the local landowners. In return for paying tribute to the Mughal treasury, they were confirmed in their positions by the emperor's officials.